There we go, I think. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the January 17th edition of the Governance and Risk meeting at MakerDAO. We have a special edition in store for everyone today. It's going to be very exciting. We're talking about stability fees. Yeah. What the stability fee is for, how we put it into practice, how the community can help manage it, and particularly, I'm assuming this is what we're going to talk about, but what I'm most interested in is how that directly affects supply and demand of circulating DAI, which is a complicated issue. Happily, we have some heavyweights on the call today, which I'm hoping will be jumping in and giving their opinions and insights. But until then, Steven, actually, you know what? I always forget. I'm not going to forget this time. If anybody has any questions they want to ask at any point during the call, please feel free just to jump in and ask. I interrupt Steven constantly. He's used to it now, so anybody else can get in on that game as well. If you don't have a microphone, type in your questions in the chat at the side, and either David or I will dig into it at the appropriate moment and read out your question for you. But we like to hear from people, so if you have a question, just jump in. Okay, there's a preamble. Steve, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Sure, no problem.
Tell us about the stability fee.
Right, so the first thing I want to mention is that I'm hoping that this particular call will be very interactive. This is not a case of me dictating to everybody what I think should happen. It's a case of opening up the format and getting a sense of expression from the community as to what you guys think should be considered along with what I'm mentioning. So the first thing we need to keep in mind is that we need to have some very broad idea of when the stability fee should be increased or decreased. And then to that end, we obviously need a point of reference. So the first question is, as a point of reference with respect to the DAI exchange rate, which one should we use? What should we consider? Should we create a policy rate that MakerDAO uses? Or do we need to have a specific rate that is relevant, or rather most regarded on a specific exchange? You know, there are a lot of options, there are a lot of permutations to consider, because it is that very case of understanding what that important DAI exchange rate is that is going to inform what we can do as far as policy implication is concerned. So that's my first question to the community, is what kind of formulation around the DAI exchange rate should we use? What sort of indicative policy exchange rate should we consider? Should we do some sort of linear combination or transformation on a range? Should we make an adjustment with respect to certain exchanges as to what their, let's call it, integrity or volume is? What's the opinion? That's the first question. I'll take a moment there for everyone just to process that.
Well, while people are processing, I want to make sure that I completely understand the question. So what you're trying to say is, like, what's the primary signal that we look at externally that says that it's time to alter the stability fee?
Yeah, what's the not just the signal, because that's a further discussion that broadens out the idea of saying it's not just the DAI exchange rate, but obviously there is the supply and demand fracture that may have occurred, how to basically think about what that looks like. What does it look like in terms of prop trading desks and their inventory management? And how does that extend to the management of the whole economic system? But that's a really huge conversation. And I'm very happy to have that conversation now, or have a look at the specific parts of it. But in essence, the most important thing is we need to have a look at an exchange rate or a combination of exchange rates and say to ourselves, when something has happened to that particular policy exchange rate, maybe we need to then trigger a force of action. We need to trigger a sequence of events to either talk, converse, or act on the change in the exchange rate. I'll give an example, and obviously this is just an example, and everyone else can contribute and or expand on it. But there may be, let's say we use a linear combination of various contributions. We weigh them appropriately, and then we say that there's a range around the dollar peg. And if either side of the range is breached for a specific amount of time, it triggers a community meeting where you sit back, you sit together and you decide what kind of data we have, how we're going to consider it, and how we're going to think about the movement in the stability fee. So in other words, it's a mechanism that starts either the conversation or the action. Now, I do not want to be prescriptive and say what we should do is the following, because I've got, I'm sure there's quite a few opinions and quite a few ways of dealing with this, and that is why I would like this forum to be the starting point in discussing that.
So I have a couple of thoughts, Steven, if you guys will entertain me. So I guess it depends on the quality of the data. So you'd want to get like an exchange pair with probably an exchange that really polices and monitors manipulative trading activity, like wash trading and all that kind of stuff, and probably have the most liquid pairs under the eyes of like this of like us, right? But then how do you establish a range? Because doesn't it really matter? I mean, I don't know how much time of like back testing and how much time of observation on a particular pair should you go before establishing a real range? Like how long should you observe that pair?
Well, that's a valid point, because the direct answer would be based on the integrity of the data that you want to use for any sort of empirical analysis. So to a certain extent, this is more a combination of a calculated perspective in terms of what models we should use versus the actual data that we have, and to the extent the data is actually valid in contributing to informing our decision. That's why I'm looking right now at the sort of collective conscience of all the people involved, so that we can get more a sense of not just there's data, let's use a model that is the most prescriptive and the most deterministic thing to do and the most obvious thing to do, but there are too many angles, there's too much subjectivity, and this is due to the fact that we are obviously in the process of bootstrapping to critical mass. And while we're in that process, we don't have the luxury of perfect knowledge or perfect data. So we've got to try and balance that off appropriately. As to the range, that's why I'm not prescribing, but I'm putting a suggestion down. And from that, we can either discuss whether it's even possible to make a range. And if it is a range, what should it be? Because there's two aspects to the range. There is one that is business oriented and says, well, what makes you competitive in terms of being a stable coin? And then there is the other side that basically says, what really is the sensitivity with respect to the system and how it operates? So I want to leave that out there as well.
So yeah, what models are you guys relying on right now to kind of make these empirical conclusions about where the DAI savings rate should be?
What are they? Like from the economic point of view,
like what kind of what kind of models are you guys relying on?
Well, right now the models are, I would say, mostly kind of abstract to the point of looking at very singular data points and saying, what do we need to do with these data points? And that is obviously one of the reasons behind having this sort of community call. In order to do a couple of things. One is basically putting forward suggestions so that folks can think about what we're talking about. And the other thing is really talking about what data we have and what models can be applied to it. So the idea of what models we're applying is kind of irrelevant, because ultimately you need to be able to justify that, and you need to grow it, and you need to test it. And I think there are enough people online right here to tell you that to do that appropriately, that it's a bit of a temporal aspect. You really got to take a lot of time to do it. Generally speaking, what we do is we were looking for a sense of who is involved, what is the consensus around it, and what should we do with respect to the data that we have. I mean, it is, looking at the number of people I've attracted today on this call, it gives you a sense of how important this is and how, I would say challenging it is as well.
I think part of one of the questions could be not necessarily what do you want. I would actually reverse it and say, what do you want to make sure it isn't? So rather than coming up with a computational range, wouldn't one of the ways to start off would be to say, do we want it to be lower than 0? And at least that starts the discussion of what we don't want it to be.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And you've got a broad range of permutations you need to sort of start knocking out as unacceptable candidates, I suppose. It is a good point, but as I said, there is the theoretical underpinning, there's the empirical basis that justifies the sensitivity, and then there is the business case. So those three intersections are quite interesting to try and employ.
On the business case side, one thing that I would throw in as a variable to consider, if we look at Maker as a credit facility, right, which hopefully one day, I understand the stability fee allowing DAI to come back into its peg, but then from the outside perspective of this being a credit facility for secured loans and looking at what's competitive in the market for secured loans, right? Because in the future, hopefully as more and more people own crypto, they will survey, say, their different options. And for example, I can go to NerdWallet and I can see all my different rates. And I would hope that someday Maker's in there as, a competitive loan provider, hopefully beneath everyone else. And so maybe that's the upper bound, right? If we're trying to find some range, we want Maker to always be competitive as a credit facility to the demand side, but then also have the rate be such that DAI doesn't necessarily lose its peg.
Yeah, so the idea, let me just see if I got this right. The range I'm referring to is the range with respect to the peg, not obviously the stability fee. So what I'm trying to get at is that if we have a good sense of what that DAI exchange rate is that we're going to use as the policy exchange rate, and we have some sort of idea about the range for that that exchange rate, it might trigger the elements it might trigger the necessary processes for us to consider, what the changes in stability fee might be. So that's the sequence of thinking that I'm starting with. To your point about the stability fee being competitive from a business point of view, I think what I'm saying from the business angle is, if you make, and here's an example, if we decide that the range around the peg is 85 cents and $1.15, that obviously is not going to be very competitive from a business aspect, because as far as stable coins are concerned, we start looking less like one. So we need to obviously have a sufficient range in place to make sure we do have that business mindset and that competitive mindset in the space, but at the same time respecting the fact that we are bootstrapping to critical mass and we also do have theoretical foundations to work from.
It feels to me a bit that we need to obviously figure out, like you said, what that range is above and below $1, and also take into account the way that our natural arbitrage begins to either kick in or tail off in that scenario. That's going to be one of the factors. But I think that I guess one of the questions, and this is everything I know about how we internally figure out the stability fee, I've learned through Reddit posts and chat rooms. So I don't have some deep insight into this, but I know that there's been discussions that market making teams have sort of given us internal signaling about how their operations have been working and the pressures that they have in order to continue to make markets profitably. Mm-hmm. And we've also seen this external signal, which is the long-term over a week or 2 weeks graphs, are they showing that we are drifting slightly above or slightly below a peg across a bunch of different markets, right? So it feels to me like it's a combination between what's the appetite for natural arbitrage, mm-hmm. the impact on the market-making organizations that work with MakerDAO, which that's a trickier set of data, because obviously as part of their businesses, they don't reveal that kind of thing publicly.
But they could possibly contribute towards what they think the stability fee may be, given their inventory. Almost like in a LIBOR type framework.
Well, that's interesting. But so, is a market makers organization, are their interests aligned with the general MakerDAO community, though? Could we trust them saying that, hey, MakerDAO, you should raise or lower the stability fee?
Well, in essence, the answer is no, but you hope that they're self-serving, and to a certain extent, if you've got enough differences of incentive, then you might shake it out to be a more robust contribution. Very much in the way LIBOR is set, you literally are surveying a whole bunch of banks and relying on the fact that they've done their internal analysis and they've come out with what they consider to be the clearing rate of interest that allows their bank to operate profitably. The same sort of thing you would think from these contributing trading desks as well. So that's the hope going forward. I think it's a broader scope in terms of when that could happen, but essentially that is one of the data points, one of the contributing factors that you could actually include in establishing what the stability fee should be. There's also the idea, very much like the LIBOR idea, is what is the frequency or cadence at which you need to consider this, regardless of what is actually happening in the market, because the anticipatory benefits of talking about this has some contribution towards stabilizing an otherwise dislocated demand-supply function that you might find in your system. And to a certain extent, that could be used as well. In other words, like this discussion today, folks contributing, and you might find that the general gist of this conversation is that the stability fees may have to be decreased, or the stability fee should be increased. Just that gist today might have the effect of folks going off and actually acting on this and getting that anticipated effect. Now, what I'm also trying to get a sense of is not only when should we as a community act, and that is what is the policy rate that we use, what is the range that basically we need to consider, and how long must it be in breach of that range before we need to take some sort of action. And then obviously the effect of that is, what is that action and what is the increments of that action. Now, if we had a very robust economy with enough depth and breadth, you could get a firm empirical analysis from a sensitivity point of view, and you could get a clear sense of what you could do and what you need to do, given a certain level of confidence. While we're bootstrapping, we need to have a clear idea of what models we'd like to apply from a subjective point of view, and then try and figure a way of actually applying it appropriately that makes sense. It could ultimately formulate itself into a more rigorous program going forward. This is not exactly easy.
Steven, the idea here, just so I understand it properly, is we want to have a signal that makes us as a community more responsive to mismatches in supply and demand, and so that we can rigorously say, if X criterion is met, then we should all come together and discuss whether we should change the stability fee. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
That is the general context. How that is implemented is obviously another thing altogether, but that is the sort of general hope as to what we could do. It could literally be just a case of folks in the community realizing that this is the case, and they may simply put through proposals, or they may simply just put through some messaging in the right place and say, listen, we need to think about upping it by 1/4 of a point or 1/2 of a point, or the other way around. How that is implemented is not exactly clear in my head, but
well, I think that one of the issues we're dealing with is that we're in a very immature marketplace and economy. there's not a lot of strong signals. A lot of the data can't really be trusted, and everybody's in beta or hoping to get out of beta soon. So I think that maybe ties back a bit into how things were done previously. And I'm guessing, but I think that it's been no secret that MakerDAO, up until we release multi-collateral DAI, is largely in a small-scale testing phase. Like, we're confident that the thing works now, but we haven't taken the gloves off. And in order for us to figure out what some of the logical parameters or ranges or thresholds in the system are, we need to test things out in non-destructive ways. And I think one of those tests previously was, let's divide the stability fee by 5 and see if that moves the needle in an appreciable manner and that's a safe range for us to play with in order to see what happens, right? I don't want to say that we're just rolling dice here, because obviously we're not. There's lots of clever people thinking about these types of things, but
there's a lot of... Sorry, carry on.
So we've moved it from 2.5 to 5. I think that I think that from my own perspective, that seems to have worked, right? Whether it works specifically because of our change in the stability fee, or external market forces just happen to align with our end goals, I'm not entirely clear on. But we seem to have found a very comfortable and small range that seems to move the needle in the way that we expected. Is that accurate, you think?
I hope so. The one thing that you can't really account for are the confounding variables in between. I mean, there is a correlation between shark attacks and people eating ice cream, but that just happens to be a nice summer day that really causes both. The same thing over here is, it needs to be considered. Are we, by moving the stability fee, just creating an anticipatory effect and people are acting on it? You got to answer that question in a much broader perspective, and that is the actual economic environment on the blockchain space as a whole, because we can't rise higher than what that activity is, because we are part and parcel of that activity. And if that activity is sparse, if it doesn't have that robustness of depth and breadth, then we need to be very cognizant of it, and we need to be able to act subjectively and act as a community with that in mind.
So it feels like this conversation is about where do we find reliable, indicative data sets that we can use, and how, after we find an appropriate change, how do we separate signal from noise on from the results to figure out whether what we did actually had an impact, right?
Exactly. I mean, in the beginning as well, you'll have a sense of it, but you won't be able to sort of manifest that into statistically confident data sets or calculations. But as we progress, so the data will come in. As we progress, the economy in which we are involved and in which we are helping create will become more vibrant, and from that we can have a lot more reliability placed on that data. And obviously from there we can have our empirical analysis and applied models increase in confidence. But right now what we're looking at is, as you said, it's a whole system in its infancy. In my opinion, and this is maybe because I'm biased, MakerDAO is ahead of the game. And the one aspect is we've got extraordinarily smart people working on something that is ahead of the game, but we don't have enough meat in which to take that massive tool set of possibilities and apply it. We can only take out maybe a spanner and a hammer and start using that, as opposed to the delicate instruments that folks have in terms of their brain capacity and obviously their ability to apply that. So we've got to be very clear as to what we can use when and the reason why. So we would like to increase the stability fee. We would like to increase it because of certain movements in the rate of the exchange. We'd like to increase it because we believe the inventories are building up again. But we think that it's also important that the community is involved in terms of saying, well, where's this data coming from? How are we going to use this data? What does it look like? And, this is how I would act on it. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because, and this is where the interactive part really starts becoming clear, you can place those functionalities within the risk teams that I hope will be part of the decentralized risks function for MakerDAO. There are many aspects that you can involve here. And the one thing that will also be very clear to everyone is that being a risk team and being cognizant of how the risks go from legal all the way through to economic are not just something that someone else does. It actually behooves us to consider all of it at the same time.
So it sounds like it sounds like there's two separate things here, at least in my mind. One could pertain to perhaps the more mundane thing of like what specific pieces of data should we be looking for? How do we use statistics to conduct inference and build a model and in order for us to achieve various goals? But then that's secondary to what we want the model and the data sources to achieve for us. And Steven, you mentioned some very good ones so far. One is being more sensitive and aware of mismatches in supply and demand. The other one that I thought was an excellent point is allowing the data to give us a sense and allow us to be cognizant of MakerDAO's embeddedness in the broader crypto economy and movements that are largely outside of our control. So those two are important, but what other things do we want from this model? And then we can ask the questions of, okay, these are the things we want to accomplish. Okay, what tools do we have in order to get there? So those two are two that come to mind. Maybe it makes some sense to spend some time brainstorming on other requirements that we want from these models.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Steven.
Go ahead, Rich.
Well, I was just going to say that that's a great point, because one of the things we need to consider when we're talking about stability fees is that's the margin that the system uses to support itself. Ultimately, that's where in the future the DAI savings rate will come from. It's where potentially we could use that pool to incentivize the broader ecosystem that we use to support MakerDAO. So we need to keep a buffer in this system, right? And that comes from the stability fee. So that would be the third major consideration, right?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. As a metric to just float out there and consider. I mean, right now this is a singular dimensional or singular collateral. In the world in the future, it'll be multi-collateral. One metric just to float out there to consider would be, amount of supply or DAI outstanding related to how much collateral. Now, if we, in a multi-collateral scenario, if you put, let's just imagine a $50 million US Treasury and tracked that capital that was borrowed against it, it would give you an idea of how much you're creating and destroying the supply of a currency. When it's only based on Ether, you said it right. I mean, it's a very, very young product with a very subset of users. Now you start introducing capital markets, and to the gentleman's point before about having how it competes in the business space, 50 basis points borrowing against a $50 million treasury, and you'll watch everybody in the world find a way to optimize that.
No, precisely. I mean, there are the growth of the collateral portfolio is not just with the objective of extracting stability into the system, but it has a broader, profound business aspect as well. This is not the general idea behind an investment portfolio where all you're doing is optimizing expected risk against expected return against expected risk. You have to think about minimizing risk while optimizing for the business efficiency and efficacy of the system. And that is what you just mentioned now is one of the components. How competitive are you with respect to your rates in comparison to the type of collateral that you've accepted? Your point is valid in terms of what kind of value has been extracted from it and how is it being used. These elements really add up to understanding the economy in which we find ourselves, and obviously the economic ecosystem which MakerDAO creates. Very more poignant, more important to consider. But where we are now, it is really a case of saying, we have not only all the talent necessary, I can assure you, just from MakerDAO's perspective as well, the folks that work here, we've got all the talent necessary to contribute towards getting the ideal models in place. But it really is a case of saying, well, how do we get the catalyst that spurs us to go from where we are now to those final models? And that really is about community dialogue. The only way you're going to get there, the only way you're going to start implementing and manifesting real action is by the community getting involved and looking at this from all the different angles until we can arrive at the models that everyone is very sort of acutely aware of, but also very much used to. There's a lot of the sort of traditional economic models and traditional space that we can, economic models and traditional tools that we can move over to this space, but we first need to get to a level of robustness where they can apply and we can actually get a feedback mechanism from them that is meaningful. Because right now, and there's a few folks on the line right now, they can attest to the fact that looking at the sensitivity due to volumes that we see on exchange is extraordinarily hard to do, because as everyone is aware, to what extent does that volume really show true activity? And due to that simple consequence, this kind of forum is necessary. We need to have, firstly, a sense of subjectivity that creates the starting point to allow us to fill all these structures that we hope to start using in full later on in the life of the MakerDAO system. So I shall pause there for a moment.
There's actually
I think that there's a lot to absorb right now, and this is going to be a really interesting conversation. I think we're probably going to need another call after this one, because we're getting into the weeds and we're also getting a bit philosophical. But what I'd like to do, Steven, if it's all right with you, is maybe I can just rapid fire through some of the questions that we've been collecting in the side, and then maybe we can circle back to a higher, or maybe see if we can come up with some conclusions and recap some of these ideas before the end of the call. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, by all means, please do. Thank you.
All right. Well, there's one thing that we could consider, because we haven't really explained exactly what the stability fee is for people that might be very new to the system. So maybe we can come up with like a 1-minute explanation.
Okay, the 1-minute explanation, and I feel that I may have to elaborate on this 1-minute explanation, is that it's a threefold function. Firstly, it has a component that says it speaks to the economic risk inherent in the collateral type that you've included. It is also a policy instrument pertaining to the collateral type that you've included. And at the same time, you can also have a component that is a broader policy instrument for the collateral portfolio as a whole. So that's just in a nutshell. So you got the three elements. One is the actual risk that you've been compensated for in terms of the collateral type, the policy instrument in determining how to allow for the supply and demand structures to be in equilibrium with that collateral type, and then a component that allows the collateral portfolio as a whole to contribute to DAI supply and demand function to be in equilibrium. So, and the heart of the stability fee is to essentially be used to compensate and to adjust for supply and demand. That's in a nutshell. There are broader definitions that allow you to go down separate avenues as to what stability fee really could be in certain senses, but I think for this forum, I think that should be an adequate explanation.
Okay, cool. I'm going to keep on rapid firing these things, so we don't get bogged down. I'm going to mercilessly kill this pronunciation. Marcin. I'm sorry, man. I don't know how to pronounce that. He asks for a rephrase, and this is an interesting clarification. So what happens if the fee is set too high or it's set too low? And how do we know that that's happened?
Well, to the second part, you don't. especially right now, because we don't have enough breadth and depth of economy to really have a good sense of what the feedback numbers would look like. We would literally have to say, well, what is an increment that we have seen before? How have we seen the adjustment in the supply of dye? And then from that, using a little bit of subjectivity and saying, well, what is it that I expect? I mean, we went from 0.5 to 2.5 back to 0.5 again, and we've seen what the effect it has had. Now, is it really a calculated sensitivity? Is it really something to do with 2%? Or was it more to do with the fact that it was just merely increased and merely decreased? So what is...
Or did more people just learn about it?
Yes, that's it. There's a lot of confounding factors that we don't know yet, but will eventually transpire as we go along with this project. But the one aspect that we do know is that we are constrained by what is effectively offered external to the blockchain economy. I mean, if you have a look at the interest rates charged in the traditional world, they are your constraints. Where is our ceiling? Well, the ceiling hits up, let's say, against 3.5%, 4%, where you're no longer being competitive. And if you really want to constrain supply and you purposefully want to do it, then you can go past that ceiling, knowing that's what you want to do, knowing that that's going to be the effect. So what is too high? I'd say anything that becomes less competitive in terms of the traditional sense. Going too low, well, you can go to 0, and as pointed out by someone in the chat, in multi-collateral DAI, and I would take his word for it, you can actually go negative. But to that extent, when it happens and why it happens, I'm not completely sure of why that might be the case. But
I think that the negative question is a great one, but I'm super hesitant to talk about that because we get really deep into the weeds. So, well, for the next question I want to throw out at you, Steven, is, and this is a puzzler for me, how do we know that DAI isn't trading where we want it to trade? The data is gross, CMC can't be trusted, everybody wash trades like crazy. So how do we know that it's 1.5 or 1.05?
We got to put proxy metrics in place. We got to start somewhere. And that's why this particular meeting is so important. It's all about saying, it's not trying to be deterministic and understand that we have to have formulas that are going to answer questions for us. It literally is saying, well, let's start at this point of view because that is the best guess that we have right now. It's the best interpretation of what we see. And I think this forum is now timely due to the fact that we have had 1 year of very successful operation of DAI. And at the same time, we've had a couple of movements in the stability fee. So we've seen that this thing has levers and the levers have had some effect. Now it's time to look at these at this effect and say, well, what is it? What can we make of it? And where do we get the data from it? How do we filter for wash trading? How do we focus on true volume? Where is the integrity of the data? How do we rely on it?
That's interesting because that sounds like maybe that's one of the first steps that as a community we can start taking is maybe solicit. And this is, I'm sort of stealing this idea from David as well. Thank you, David, in the chat, that maybe we just determine where do we find good data and what does the community consider good data to be? Should we start talking about where that comes from and how we whitelist it?
Yeah, I'm actually, if I can add to that, I'm actually posting on Reddit some things to consider. For example, should the community whitelist a bunch of data sources? Should we consider things like whether the exchange polices for wash trading or volume manipulation? Should we consider how old the pair is and whether we can backtest it against previous changes to stability fees in our DAI credit system? And then how readily available is that data? And then after that, we can already establish what an acceptable range for healthy trading is. But then if the range is breached, what then should be considered? Is the range being breached regularly in a particular direction? How much time should pass when observing these trends of breaching? And then all of that is to say, where can the community readily access this information? Are there going to be places where we can look at this information that maybe was aggregated by somebody in the community and made available. But it seems like a lot of these things are very sort of closed doors. Like I can't readily get statistics on a particular trading pair as a regular community member. So like there's a lot of questions that are up in there, but I'm making a little post on Reddit, a comment to your thread.
David, you've just described a large function of what we've spoke about on many of these meetings as a risk team. That's effectively what a risk team should do. You've got, as previously mentioned, you can have a risk team that goes through the full spectrum of all the requirements of risk functionality that MakerDAO requires, or you can have risk teams that focus on specific components and contribute. And one of them is, and I think I mentioned it a couple of times before as well, is sourcing data and obviously doing the necessary data cleaning. And I'm always hesitant to use the word data cleaning because in the traditional sense and in the crypto sense, it actually kind of means two different things. But do the data cleaning and basically extract the integrity of the data so that we can use. It is a massive undertaking. It's not an easy thing to do, especially in this environment. And then submitting that data. It could be literally just a case of someone saying, I've done this, I've contributed to MakerDAO, which then obviously brings up the other thing of if there are going to be a risk team, how are they going to be acknowledged as a risk team? How are they going to be compensated for doing so? Because you need to have that incentive there. You know, this aspect of discussing the stability fee is the first manifested idea of implementation that a risk team should be doing. And it really boils down to who wants to put their hand up, who wants to contribute, how do we get them involved with the MakerDAO system, how do we pass them as a risk team, how do we validate the way that they source their data and clean their data, and when everything has been approved by the Maker community, that particular team can then contribute its data to other risk teams or just to the system in general where people can come and download. The sky is the limit. The permutations are there. Everybody can see it. It makes a lot of sense. And using the stability fee right now, I think it brings a lot of it home on how you can actually just simply wake up one day and go, you know what, I can actually be a risk team, one of the contributing risk teams. So yes, you're talking about everything from data sourcing to figuring out all kinds of metrics that allow you to give that data integrity. And the methods that you've just mentioned, the metrics that you've just discussed are extraordinarily important. And at the same time, you're going to invigorate more debate from other folks who are going to think of other metrics. And in aggregate, you're going to create something that is more of a robust framework in terms of understanding what that data may be. And obviously, and that's where you provide a very clear competitive edge for MakerDAO as a system.
Okay, so we're coming up with a lot of really interesting ideas, but I want to continue some momentum here because we have a lot of people on the call and a lot of questions to address. So towards the end of the meeting, let's figure out what the next steps are and how we can continue some of these deeper discussions. But I want to address something that Darius asked in the chat. He says, is there a case for a feedback loop controller framework? So at some point, and this is the discussion we've had in the past, but will we come up with an algorithm that can sort of take care of how stability fees are determined based on this sort of, it's trying to achieve sort of homeostasis? Is that reasonable?
That is reasonable, and there are some other folks on this call right now that could quite easily answer that to the affirmative and expand on that even more. But the inherent presumption to that is a robustness. You've got to have any sort of algorithmic approach, any kind of feedback requires a certain level of robustness of the economy or of the information that you're using. Otherwise, all you're going to do is create a subjectivity going in and getting a feedback of your own subjectivity. So you may be exposed to garbage in, garbage out. Trying to formulate when we think the breadth and depth of economy has become such that it is robust, that is also another question that is not easily answered. It's something that you sort of organically grow into. You organically realize as you contribute towards the system as you contribute towards its efficacy and its stability. And you basically make it a self-fulfilling prophecy where one day you're talking about 17 different algorithms being applied to creating a feedback mechanism, and you're not aware of the fact that you've actually gone through a massive growth in robustness.
But are you referencing actually using that algorithm to change the value, or simply to make a recommendation and then people make decisions on it?
Oh, I would definitely just use the major assumption here that it's suggestions, because at the end of the day, governance makes the final call. It goes into proposal and governance has to basically vote on it. So
it refers to a common thread in these meetings now. I want to reiterate that for the large crowd that we have today, is that in the technical space, the IT space, the crypto space, we have a tendency to search for magic algorithms and hoping that those will save us and we'll be able to quantify what humans do in human situations. And I think that what we're doing at MakerDAO is pretty important, and I don't think we can trust the machines to pull those levers for us. So that's why governance and why these meetings are such a critical aspect of what we do, is in order to have some greater and deeper judgment before the machines start making decisions for us. It'd be a kind of a terrifying thing, I think, if the algorithm was able to set fees for us.
Agreed.
Okay, so let's continue. I want to also reference a question that we saw in the subreddit. And it talked about the fact that we're changing the stability fee. We've changed it 3 times. We're going to potentially change it again soon. And that the better, more accurate way of looking at the stability fee is it's a variable rate. And people need to sort of understand that it's a variable rate. Does that create some sort of insurmountable friction to use the system, in your opinion, Steven? I'm assuming that variable rates are a fairly common thing in the traditional finance space, and flipping from 2.5 to 0.5 is not unusual, or?
Well, the change, the difference in change is obviously unusual, because interest rates are generally applicable to hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of value floating in a system. So a couple of basis points really has an effect. It's called PV01 or DV01, or just linear delta products. Everything is on a basis points valuation. Now, if you reference the lower credits, like the lowest credits securities out there, even those changes are not massive unless there is an underlying issue with the organization, and it really is something that is expressed through a massive change in credit. And to that extent, it's not really applied here. But what we've got to keep in mind is that because we're in the infancy, because we're bootstrapping to this critical mass, these movements, and this basically may answer, I saw a question come up here in terms of what are some of the outtakes from the last change of fees, is that we got the effect that we, as a community desired. We changed the fees, the supply decreased. We changed the fees, the supply increased. So did the outcome work? Did the desired effect happen? Yes, it did. Can we say with enough confidence that it is something that we can attribute to a percentage change level? Not so much. And that's what we got to discover. We've done something, it has worked appropriately. Now we need to put our collective minds together to figure out what is the next best move in terms of figuring out what the change should be. So
So can I actually say something to that? Unless you want to go, Rich, but I have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, let me just finish off the thought, and then we can move on to the next question. So that's something that I hadn't considered before. So we need to take into account when we're acquiring or coming up with this final list that variable rates do have a significant impact in the planning process for somebody who might want to open an extremely large CDP. So that's a consideration we need to take into account as well. Just go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, so actually it really ties into what you guys are talking about. So since we're like feeling around what controlling the stability fee looks like, we've adjusted the fee up to 2.5% and then down to 0.5%. And like these are like really huge moves, but like not for us because we're a really small and nascent market, right? But do you we've seen like what this has caused in the short term. Should we think about maybe narrowing the changes to like 1% increments or 0.5% increments for better like early data? So like moving forward, do you think it makes sense to kind of limit our changes to increments of some predefined percentage?
Yeah, so there's two factors here, and I think someone just stole my thunder. Who was that? Because as I was just about to say that.
Oh, Michael, the size of the moves.
Mr. Dunworth, thank you very much for having me around your place yesterday, by the way. But yes, he is absolutely correct. It's not only just the frequency, but the cadence in which you operate. The one aspect that's very important here is firstly the size. You spot on. I would start looking at a suggestion of 0.5 point. That is just my contribution to this conversation. But I think it may need to be a conversation that we have on a weekly basis in this particular forum. It may not take up the whole conversation, but it may just be a case of, folks, what do you think has changed? Do you think there's something that has been material that has changed over the past week? If no, okay, cool. So we can carry on our discussion somewhere else. The informality of it, don't let it fool you. It's just a premise from which we have to start. It's a premise from which we can start formulating context and design, and also what the idea is towards getting to a more formal structure. So initially, I would say we should start thinking in terms of 50 basis points at a time, and we should have at least some sort of discussion on a weekly basis, or some sort of place to contribute ideas on a weekly basis. I would suggest, and this is where I leave it to Rich to correct me, but we do have rocket channels, public rocket channels, to which you can contribute. You can start looking at and say, inventories are looking like they're going down. We may need to think about getting stability feedback down again. Oh, inventories are going up. We need to do this. The point being is we need to start this discussion, and we need to make sure that we have it on a frequent enough basis where it becomes part of the conversation and part of the idea, and the continual idea rather, of looking after MakerDAO as a system. Because if you think about it, the executive proposal that makes up the executive part of the system is on a continuous basis. So it should suggest that if we are going to, in a perfect world, continually extract value from proposals being executed on a continuous system, then we need to do the same thing from the risk point of view. But it's going to be impractical to start immediately. So we need to start with something that makes sense, that you can start talking about, and hopefully from that something organic grows that we all gets not only a good sense of, but a lot of confidence in. And don't let me give you the suggestion that, especially the folks that are online right now, there are plenty of folks that have got very good ideas of what that model should ultimately look like. There's no shortage of knowing what to do. It's just trying to create the data, the information, and the fodder with which to work.
Well, that's a great point to maybe start wrapping things up. So we discussed a great deal in today's meeting, and there's a lot of really interesting suggestions. And to speak to the point, one of the points that you just made, Steven, we're probably we're arriving at that time where the community is getting involved and wants to get involved, as you can tell from the standing room only in this call. It might be time to start formalizing where those communications happen and recording some of the ideas and thoughts and next steps that we get out of these calls. So I think that's what we'll do. This one is going to require a rewatch, so I'm going to go through it again. I'll take some notes. I'll figure out some of the questions that we asked. Hoffman's team had some great suggestions about places to start aggregating some questions and what questions we want to ask. And I'll try and formalize all that into like maybe a one-pager where we can start, or at least know where to continue the conversation and where we can pick up on the next call. Does that sound like a plan?
Sounds like a good plan. I mean, yeah, I completely agree. I absolutely agree. The one aspect to keep in mind, and something that is really part parcel of decentralized risk management, is trying to figure out how to aggregate all these collective ideas into one place so that it formulates into something that is purposeful for MakerDAO. That by itself is a challenge. So, if you guys out there want to, put that in your plate, maybe chew on that a bit, and come back with ideas, that'd be great as well. I mean, we do have our own ideas. There's tooling that we can create. There's a whole bunch of ideas, but honestly speaking, I think this is something that if we can broadly stick it out there, I get the sense that we'll get top-notch suggestions.
All right, that sounds great. Do you have any final thoughts, Steven, or should we wind
well,
this down?
On that point, as I said earlier, and through this discussion, the idea is to raise the rates. And my suggestion is, as I said, my contributing suggestion is going to be 50 basis points. And the subjective but inherent logic that I'm trying to use here is that we've moved by a factor of 2%, and we've seen the effect. It might behoove us to try and move at a slower increment and to see what further effect we get. So please keep that in, put that in your pipe and consider that as well. And look out, you might find that more will come out in terms of articles, some things that are published. Look out at Reddit, look out for it on Reddit, and then we'll take it from there.
All right, sounds great. This was an excellent meeting, so thank you for that, Steven. Thanks, everyone, for your amazing questions. Look for a post soon, hopefully by the end of the day, that condenses and recaps a lot of the questions and discussions we had here. We can use that as a starting point for our next call.
Much appreciated. Thank you all. Very cool. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.